They called me legacy overhead right before they pulled out the one pin holding the entire company together. They thought firing me was operational efficiency. Until every license, audit, vendor, and major client began falling like a row of dominoes. Legacy overhead. That was the first phrase I heard used about me. Not in a formal performance review. Not through a polite email from Human Resources. But through Jason Reed's slick little voice, the moment the video call came alive. I was in the middle of updating a compliance audit sheet. My eyes moving through renewal dates, license codes, certification chains, and federal timestamps that had quietly kept the company alive for years. Jason appeared on the screen with a smile polished harder than his actual competence. 30 years old. If I was being generous. The kind of man who could use the word efficiency in every sentence, and believe a few colorful charts made him an operational genius. The chief financial officer introduced him as an efficiency fixer. But I had spent enough years inside corporate walls to know the real translation, a man with an axe. Wearing a smile. Walking into a room and calling the chopping sound innovation. Jason talked about optimization, streamlining, and removing process redundancies. I looked straight at the screen and did not blink. I knew his gaze paused on me longer than on the others. Not because he understood what I did, but because he thought he had already found the first old object to throw out of storage. I did not react. I simply saved the folder containing every license document, every federal renewal timestamp, every internal compliance chain, and every responsibility tied to my name. I renamed the folder Church Pancake Recipes, then backed it up to a private drive. I was 42 years old. Not a nervous rookie who could be shaken by a cheap smirk and a blazer full of buzzwords. By lunchtime, I heard Jason joking in the break room with two junior analysts about removing old generation infrastructure. I was not from the generation he was mocking, but in Jason's little universe. Anyone who did not turn every workflow into short videos, emojis, and productivity slogans was apparently a fossil. I walked past with my cold coffee in hand and recorded every word in my head. Not because I was fragile. I had lived long enough in corporate spaces to stop losing sleep over casual disrespect. What interested me was the emptiness behind his confidence. Jason did not understand one basic thing. Some systems look old because they were built to survive, not to impress. The huddle that followed happened in the open work area, where everyone stood in a loose circle, as if common sense were about to be exercised. Jason pulled up a slide deck packed with expensive-sounding nothing. Phrases like adaptive compliance ecosystem and decentralized accountability hubs. A few interns nodded with the reverence of people watching a technology prophet descend from the clouds. I stood at the edge of the circle, arms crossed, listening as he said certain team members with historical responsibilities would be reassessed for alignment with the lean strategy. Then he looked directly at me and called my contributions historical. Historical. As if I were some dusty relic stored in Human Resources' basement. I smiled. Not a polite smile. Not a nervous one. It was the smile of a woman watching someone walk into a bear trap she had spent years covering with leaves. That night, I stayed in the office later than usual. Not because Jason had frightened me. I stayed because I wanted to hear the system breathe. The way a mother might stand over her sleeping child before someone barges in and claims they know how to raise it better. I checked my credentials across 3 federal platforms, every active certification, every renewal code, every licensing control, every legal PIN, every audit clearance. All of it was still tied to my name. I reviewed each timestamp, cross-checked each license group, and reopened the contract clause no one in management had ever been patient enough to read. Section 7C. In the event of involuntary termination, all company-paid licensing responsibilities and regulatory certifications would be considered void, and all credentials would be formally rescinded within 48 hours of contract nullification. Dry words. Cold words. But to me, They were a safety lock installed deep inside the machine. I had requested that clause years earlier. After watching leadership nearly let someone leave while their legal authority remained hanging over the system like a live wire. Back then, they nodded it through because they thought compliance was paperwork. No one understood that paperwork was what allowed vendors to ship, clients to sign, and regulators to leave the lab doors open. If you are listening and have ever been dismissed just because you were the quiet person keeping everything from collapsing, comment number 1. So, I know you understand that feeling too. When I left the building that night, no one noticed. But I noticed the way Jason looked at me the next morning. Like a lion staring at a cow. Unaware that the cow had access to predator drones. By the following Tuesday, Jason had taped a poster above the copier saying, "Compliance did not equal complacency." The insulting part was that he used a font so childish I had to look twice to make sure I had not wandered into an elementary school art room. Then the real performance began. Every employee, yes, every employee, was told to re-interview for their evolved role. Management presented it as a bonding opportunity, a chance to reposition ourselves, as if we should feel grateful for the privilege of explaining why we deserve to keep doing the jobs already printed on our health insurance records. One by one, people walked into conference rooms with professional smiles stretched over panic. The newer employees came out glowing, repeating lines like, "Jason really sees my potential," or "He is bringing fresh air into the company." I wanted to tell them that some fresh air comes from a broken sewer pipe. But I kept my mouth shut. When my turn came, I did not bring a resume. I brought calm. Jason barely looked up from his laptop when he said my name. He said I had been here a while. I answered, 10 years. My voice was so level even I could hear the ice in it. He tapped a few keys. Said the company valued my institutional knowledge. Then opened a rushed organizational chart. There was a box labeled Regulatory Compliance Management. My name had been crossed out. Beside it were the words pending reassignment. Then he opened a tab about the next renewal delegation plan. I saw the note immediately. Can this be transferred downstream? In Jason's language. Downstream meant dumping a legal authority chain onto someone too inexperienced to know the difference between a license requirement and a software password. When I returned to my desk, I opened the database I had built myself back in 2016. It was not a pretty spreadsheet designed to impress people in meetings. It was the nervous system of the entire compliance operation. Every certificate, every expiration date, every governing body, every signature authority, every renewal condition, every verification link, every audit history note. There were 43 items on the list. 43 licenses. 43 strands of legal red tape woven into a net so tight, the company could operate confidently without any executive ever asking what held it together. All of them were tied to me. Not because I wanted power, because for years, every time I suggested training a qualified backup, they said the budget was not right, or growth was the priority, or we would revisit it later. I exported the newest copy of the log, encrypted it, compressed it, renamed it Employee Birthday Cake List, and sent it to a private account for evidence. Then I cleared the sent record. Call me paranoid if you want. But women who spend years in compliance learn one thing very well. When children wearing management badges start playing with matches, you had better know where the fire extinguisher is and what the insurance policy says. If you are finding this story worth following, please like the video, because somewhere out there, plenty of people have been called outdated simply because they were the only ones who knew how to keep the roof from burning. That afternoon, Jason reassigned my inspection preparation work to a marketing intern named Harper, who asked me whether FDA stood for Food Design Aesthetic. I looked at her, breathed out slowly, and understood that the curtain had already caught fire. Meanwhile, I was assigned to reorganize the janitorial supply shelf. Jason said it would keep me in the operational loop at a foundational level. Foundational level, which sounded like a polite corporate way of saying mold. I asked, very gently. Whether I still had administrative access to the licensing dashboard. Jason blinked as if I had spoken an ancient language. He said he thought the access had been routed to Harper the previous week, then asked whether I really needed it anymore. Harper had just learned how to combine multiple PDF files. I did not argue. I nodded, left the area, logged in from a terminal in the back hallway, and revoked her access through the shadow admin panel I had never told anyone about. Not because I wanted to sabotage anything. More precisely, because I refused to let someone without proper authority wander into a federal system and drag both the company and herself into legal trouble. If I was being pushed off the ship, that did not mean I had an obligation to leave the treasure map with the person drilling holes in the hull. Later that day, I passed Jason's glass-walled office and heard him laughing on a call, saying something about scrubbing out the old wood. He did not see me pause in the hallway. I watched his smug posture, his shiny standing desk, his overpriced coffee beside the laptop, and one image came clearly into my mind, a fuse getting shorter. Some people walk into a complex system and see dust. People like me walk in and see load-bearing structure. Jason saw an opportunity to perform. That difference always comes with an invoice. The first time I heard the junior analysts laughing at my process, I let it go. 3 of them stood near the break room, fresh out of college, still carrying the scent of borrowed confidence from online courses and social media posts about innovation. They had laid a printed copy of my old compliance flowchart on the table as if they were studying cave art. One of them mocked the color codes. Another said I still timestamped everything manually, then asked whether I knew automation existed. I walked past with my head high, but my spine burned. Not because I was embarrassed. I was angry because they had no idea that the thing they were laughing at had saved them from audits, late penalties, suspended contracts, and midnight emergency emails more times than they would ever know. By the middle of the week, I had been locked out of 3 internal dashboards, 2 of which I had designed. No warning, no transfer request, just a red error screen and a message telling me to contact the system administrator. The irony was almost elegant. I had been the system administrator. I emailed. No reply. I called human resources. The voicemail was colder than a January morning in Detroit. After 4 attempts, someone finally answered and told me all human resources requests now had to go through my departmental manager. Jason. They said his name like they were describing an official process. I heard the sound of the last door closing. I did not argue. I set down the phone and stared at my empty glowing monitor. In less than a week, they had cut me off from every meaningful interface and called it streamlining. Jason was not stupid in the obvious way. He was more dangerous than that, smart enough to dismantle, not wise enough to build. In his weekly updates to leadership, he began hiding little grenades inside corporate language, legacy processes under review, potential staffing overlap, redundant certification management identified. That last phrase made me laugh without humor. How exactly does one overlap a federal authority's signature tied to a person's biometric profile and recertification history? I had become a walking contradiction, still employed on paper, but strategically erased from the only place that understood why I needed to exist. So, I scheduled a 10-minute appointment at a small notary office above a nail salon on Monroe Avenue. No drama, no grand speech, just me, a stiff chair, and a form titled Voluntary Relinquishment of Licensing Authority. I did not sign it yet. I only notarized the option, like slipping one more safety pin into my coat pocket. Afterward, I bought a peppermint latte and returned to the office with a smile so calm it was almost dead. Jason passed me in the hallway and asked whether I was feeling more aligned that week. I told him I was just tying up loose ends. He smiled that corporate snake smile, the kind you find beside self-help books and scented candles in a bookstore. If you have not subscribed to the channel yet, please subscribe so you can follow what happens next. Because this story is not just about a lost job. It is about the moment a woman who has been underestimated starts holding a match in a room full of gasoline. Jason did not know that every loose end I tied came attached to a fuse. It happened on a Monday morning. Because, of course, the worst things in office life prefer Mondays. The air in the building smelled like reheated plastic, old coffee, and the collective pretending of people trying to love their jobs just enough to survive another week. Jason held his new weekly momentum meeting, which was basically a motivational speech for people who enjoy control. He stood at the front of the open work area in a tight blue blazer, palms out like he was calming a flock of sheep. He said we should begin with candor. I had learned that when a manager opens with candor, it means they are about to do something ugly and want it to sound mature. He said the company had done a lot of reflecting over the past few weeks, that tradition had value, but stagnation was a threat. Then he walked slowly behind my chair. I did not turn around, he said, clearly enough for everyone to hear, that certain legacy roles were no longer aligned with forward momentum. People began shifting in their seats. A few looked down at the floor. Several glanced at me and then quickly looked away, as if watching someone lose her livelihood were an impolite scene they wanted no part in. Finally, Jason announced that Olivia Hart's position had been phased out, effective immediately. No warning, no private meeting, no conversation. Just one sentence dropped into the air like a bullet. I stood. Not because I was shaking. Quite the opposite. My legs felt so steady it frightened me. Steady enough that I had to remind myself not to kick him through the glass wall. 2 young human resources employees approached, avoiding my eyes, carrying a glossy folder as if they were delivering final rites to someone who was not dead. I took it, opened it, and flipped to the termination page. No severance. Just legal language and a line for my signature. I pulled my own pen from my bag, signed in one clean stroke, and said I would need a printed copy. Jason blinked and told me everything was digital. I looked at him and repeated, printed. Human resources hesitated. I did not lower my eyes. A few minutes later, I walked out of that office with a paper copy, a stapled receipt, and the silence of a woman who knew exactly what she had just done. When I signed, Section 7C of my contract activated like a wire running beneath the floor. Every company-paid certification tied to me immediately entered the automatic revocation queue. Not expired, not suspended, nullified. Later that evening, my phone pinged with an email, confirming that my authority over the license groups had been formally relinquished. Any entities dependent on those licenses would be marked non-compliant within 24 hours, unless reauthorized by a certified replacement. I did not forward the email. I did not screenshot it for display. I did not reply. I sat in my apartment, sipped boxed wine, turned on an old sitcom, and let the digital noose tighten around what Jason called forward momentum. That night, I slept like a baby. Wednesday morning began with a small system whimper and a very expensive box of nothing. Procurement tried to confirm a shipment of medical-grade filtration components for a biotech client. It was the kind of material no one should even breathe near without 3 signatures, a biohazard stamp, and an active chain of licensing authority. The vendor replied that they could not fulfill the shipment because the receiving entity was listed as inactive. The license had expired, and they should contact the certifying officer. Guess who that was? Within a short time, anomalies began appearing. Logins failed. API calls choked. A scheduled data sync with the FDA audit portal came back rejected because the license holder was invalid. That same morning, the internal license dashboard, once clean and green like a freshly cut lawn, began glowing red like a Christmas tree in hell. Red alerts, inactive flags, orphaned credentials. Jason, still trying to play the smooth diplomat, walked into the operations pod with a takeaway coffee and said they would just update the contact information. A compliance analyst named Emily tried to explain that contact updates required certification reauthorization. and I had been the legal certifying officer. Jason told her to do it anyway. Emily said no one else was registered with the Federal Compliance Board across the active verticals, and the re-registration period would take weeks. The room went silent. Not awkward silent, fatal silent. The kind of silence that arrives when people realize the iceberg is not planning to move out of the ship's way. Jason rubbed his temples and asked why no one had told him this earlier. Emily, barely old enough to rent a car, answered that I was the one who used to tell people that. Meanwhile, I was at home in sweatpants, eating cheap cereal and reading the entire email thread. A former colleague had quietly blind copied me into. Someone had even included a screenshot of Jason's message to legal, asking whether anyone knew how to override a license expiry tag in the dashboard thing. He called the system I had built for years a thing. That dashboard was not just an administrative tool. It had been designed to lock down tighter than a vault if a revocation event fired. If someone without the proper authority tried to access a certification, the system blocked the IP address, logged the attempt in internal audit records, and flagged the intrusion. I did not build it that way out of spite. I built it that way because regulators do not care whether you meant to break the rules when you let an unauthorized person touch legal records. By noon, Human Resources was being bombarded by panicked messages from upper management. Could they get Olivia back? Did the non-disclosure agreement prevent contact? Who signed off on this? No one had answers. Because the only person who knew the answers was deciding between soup and wings for lunch. I chose both. That evening, I checked the old company's page on LinkedIn. It still proudly claimed federal certification across all operations. I almost felt bad. Almost. Because I knew that by the next day, that lie would cost them more than their pride. Friday morning did not come with real sirens. But the panic was loud enough in every calendar alert, every ringing phone, and every hard swallow around Jason's soy latte. A randomized FDA site inspection notice arrived before the official workday fully began. Random. Yes. But within a window I had always quietly prepared for every year. Color-coded, cross-referenced against vendor contracts, renewal cycles, audit schedules, and the moon phases if necessary. Inspectors did not arrive to hear presentations about agility. They arrived with checklists, authority, and the calm of people who knew the law was behind them. Before the morning had properly settled, the front desk called compliance to say 3 inspectors were asking for the license holder. Silence. Long silence. Expensive silence. Because there was no license holder. Jason, now sweating through his expensive blazer, ran to the operations wing and barked at legal, asking whether they could reinstate my credentials. A junior legal associate frantically searched the reinstatement process online like it was a banana bread recipe. Jason tried logging into the Federal Credentialing Board's portal with my old login. Access denied. He tried requesting a password reset. User not found. He called the board's help desk, got transferred several times, and was then calmly told that Olivia Hart had voluntarily relinquished her license authority. Her ID had been removed from the registry, and reinstatement required full recertification. With an average timeline of 4 to 6 weeks, Jason stared at the speakerphone as if it had just slapped his mother. He turned to Human Resources and asked what clause I had used to revoke my credentials. They flipped through the termination file, confused, saying they had only processed standard exit paperwork and knew nothing about certifications. Someone from audit cut in and asked whether I had not negotiated a specific clause into my employment contract. That was the moment the room collectively remembered that Olivia Hart was not some dusty compliance woman tucked away in an office corner. I was the linchpin. And they had yanked me out like a wisdom tooth without realizing the root was hooked into the spine. At the same time, my phone buzzed. It was Natalie from documentation. Someone who had once been kind. Someone who used to bring cookies during audit week and leave tiny doodles on my monitor back when the office still felt human. Her voice cracked when she asked whether I had done this. I stirred my coffee. looked out the window, and said no. You did. I did not slam the phone down. I did not yell. That would have given them too much power over my emotions. This was not revenge in the loud sense. It was math. 1 + 1 equals, you fired the wrong woman. The inspectors were sitting in the lobby. The company could not legally allow them into the secured wings without a licensed compliance officer present, which meant the audit could not proceed, which meant every vendor and client relying on certified compliance for active projects would be in technical breach within hours. I was getting my nails done. Midnight burgundy gel. Not because I needed to look pretty. Because real power does not need to raise its voice. It only needs to walk away. The following Monday morning, the old building reportedly smelled like stale coffee, dried sweat, and the quiet shame of a company that had just stepped on its own oxygen hose. That was when Charles B. Whitman, the chief executive officer, arrived. He had just returned from some luxury trip. Overly tanned, silk shirt still creased, walking with the confidence of a man used to believing money disinfected every mistake. He crossed the glass atrium like a Roman emperor returning from battle, waving at receptionists, pointing finger guns at junior vice presidents, and joking that he hoped they had not burned the place down while he was gone. Nobody laughed. By the time he reached the executive floor, he had multiple urgent emails about license compliance and a voicemail from legal ending with the phrase non-compliance disaster. He walked into operations probably expecting mild turbulence. Instead, he entered a plane crash. Operations frozen. Vendor shipments halted. Inspections blocked. Certifications invalid. Clients furious. The revenue dashboard flatlined. Charles asked who was handling it. Every head turned toward Jason. At that moment, Jason no longer looked like a visionary. He looked like a middle schooler who had flooded the gymnasium with glitter glue. Charles pulled my termination paperwork onto the wall monitor. Read, in silence. Scrolled. Then scrolled some more. Finally, he spoke quietly at first, as though he could not believe the syllables leaving his mouth. You fired the license holder. Charles's voice did not rise. It dropped, which was far worse. He repeated that Jason had fired the person with sole federal licensing authority across all departments. Jason stammered that my responsibilities had been deemed redundant. Charles laughed. Not like something was funny, but like a man who had just found out his child sold the family car for cryptocurrency. He pointed at the screen and said my name was on every legal document, every active license, every renewal path, every compliance chain the company depended on to exist. Legal rushed in with a manila folder listing the top 5 suspended vendors. All contracts frozen because certifications were no longer valid. And every line led back to my name. Charles turned on the room and asked how they had allowed a kid who wrote in corporate buzzword soup to fire that person. Jason tried one final rescue attempt, saying he thought they could reassign it because the records said contact information could be updated. Charles thundered that this was a federal license, not an email alias. The room went still. Then he took out his phone and looked for my contact. Nothing. Human resources murmured that they had tried reaching me, but I was unresponsive. Charles sat down, rubbed his temples, and said to get me back. Jason coughed and said I might not want to return. Charles looked at him like a bug crawling across an expensive shoe and said I would return if they paid enough. But even he knew, deep down, that the woman they had tossed away like moldy leftovers now held the keys to the kingdom. The difference was that I was no longer standing at the gate. I had built another castle. By noon, my inbox contained several high-priority emails from the old company's domain and a voicemail from an assistant named Brandon, whose voice sounded as if he had not slept since Thursday and might sell a kidney for leverage. The final subject line said the chief executive officer urgently requested my return. I did not open it immediately. I finished my late breakfast first, 2 over-medium eggs, sourdough toast, and the smug silence of a woman whose enemies were trapped under fluorescent lights while she sat beside her home espresso machine. Across the city, Charles was probably pacing his executive suite like a lion forced into customer service. And Jason? Jason had been demoted into a title that sounded long and empty: Associate Project Liaison. Level 2. Which in corporate language meant sit down. Shut up. And do not touch anything that requires a password. His standing desk had been replaced by an old hand-me-down. His monitor had become a small square relic. The only agile thing left about Jason was how quickly he had been thrown under the bus. Legal drafted a proposal for me within hours. A consulting role. Effective immediately. A minimum 6-month contract. Compensation lower than what they should have offered, but with generous result-based bonuses promised. Plus a complete gag order. No social media. No interviews. No comments to regulators. Total silence. They wrapped the offer in digital gold ribbon and a groveling note, saying they recognized the critical nature of my previous contributions and hoped I would help restore operational integrity. I read it twice. No apology. No ownership. Just desperation dressed up in human resources language. I drafted my reply under a subject line referencing the requested return by executive directive. I wrote to Charles that I appreciated the offer. Truly. But I did not return to burning buildings. Especially not buildings where I had been thrown into the fire in the name of streamlining. As requested, I attached a highlighted copy of my termination clause. Section 7C. Formal confirmation of license revocation from the National Registry Board, and a screenshot of the company's certification dashboard 72 hours after my departure, where my name still appeared. Grayed out. Irreplaceable. I closed with a short wish: compliance and clarity. No threats. No bargaining. No screaming that I had warned them. Just receipts. I clicked send and exhaled. Not like a woman mourning a lost job, but like someone closing a door she had built, installed, and locked from the outside. Charles read the email in silence. I know, because there was no immediate call. No reply. No clumsy legal rebuttal. I pictured him leaning back in his chair, eyes fixed on the screenshot of my grayed-out name. And for the first time since stepping off whatever yacht had been keeping him comfortable, he understood that they had not merely fired an employee. They had excommunicated the one person who understood the company's true religion: compliance. And I was no longer praying. I was no longer hoping they would understand. I simply let the system speak in the only language people, like Jason and Charles, were willing to hear: loss. 3 weeks later, LinkedIn nearly exploded within our industry circle. My name appeared with a new position: Olivia Hart, Director of Compliance Strategy at Norel Biosystems. My profile photo showed my hair a little lighter, my smile a little sharper, and a black suit simple enough to look like a woman arriving to collect what she was owed. The post was short. No hashtags. No false humility. No speech about the journey. Just one sentence saying I was grateful to join a team where integrity was not an afterthought. Right below it came 2 polite lines of pure fire. Norel Biosystems had secured contracts with HelixMed and Varen Labs, citing confidence in continuous compliance as the deciding factor. Those had once been the crown jewels of my old company. The 2 clients they flaunted on every earnings call. The names used to prove they were still at the top. Now, they had packed up and left after hearing the old company's certification backlog had entered an unknown reactivation window. Norel did not have to sell hard. I brought the licensing blueprint in my head and a reputation no marketing team could edit with a filter. The simple fact that my name had once secured multi-million-dollar vendor relationships was enough to tilt the scale. Meanwhile, the old company remained stuck. The dashboard never turned green again. License appeals clogged in bureaucracy. Fines arrived daily. Some automated, some hand-delivered like hate mail signed by the gods. Vendors walked. Clients panicked. The holiday party was canceled due to budget adjustments. Jason did not even get a farewell cake. 1 week before, Jason had been standing in the open work area, pointing and giving orders, and talking about forward momentum. 1 week later, he was updating his profile with vague phrases like freelance strategist. I did not hate him the way people might imagine. Hate requires more energy than he deserved. I saw him as a living example of what happens when confidence outruns competence and leadership rewards it with authority. As for me, I had my own office, glass walls, an espresso machine, and a chair that did not squeak every time I breathed. Every morning, I watched industry alerts appear like weather reports for storms I had already outflown. One alert, then another. Old company flagged non-compliant. License status pending. Audit failures under appeal. I sipped black coffee, calm and centered. Above my monitor was a single yellow sticky note pinned with a blue pushpin. No signature. No MOE. Just one steady sentence written in firm block letters. I was the license. I kept it there not to brag about winning, but to remind myself that quiet years are not invisible years. Sometimes the wrong people are simply the ones looking. Thank you for watching until the end of the video. If this story reminded you of a workplace that underestimated the person holding the whole system together, please leave one like and subscribe to the channel. I will see you again in another office story where justice does not need to scream. It only needs to wait for the right clause to activate.